Table of Contents, Phylogeny and Cladistics. In this unit, we will discuss topics including classification and naming, phylogeny and cladistics, domains and kingdoms, kingdom plantae, kingdom Animalia characteristics, and kingdom Animalia phyla and classes. Note, the last three topics are outside the scope of the AP exam and can be skipped if necessary. Classification and naming. Classification. Classification is a method of organizing species into groups called taxa. There are 8 taxa in the modern system of classification. We start off with an individual species. Recall that species are organisms that can reproduce and have fertile offspring, and then a group of similar species fit into a genus, then genera fit into a family, and then order, class, phylum, kingdom, domain, and finally all life. This modern system began with the work of Carolus Linnaeus in 1735. Linnaeus based his classification of species solely on shared characteristics. Scientists have refined the system using molecular homologies and DNA evidence. The bigger picture. Think about classification in this way. The country is divided into states, states into counties, counties into towns, towns into streets, and streets into individual houses. People living in the same house have more in common than people living on the same street. People on the same street have more in common than people living in the same town. People in the same town have more in common than people living in the same county. People in the same county have more in common than people in the same state. People in the same state have more in common than people living in the same country. The big picture. In this diagram, the continent is the broadest category. You could have people living on the same continent, but not have a lot in common. For instance, someone living in Texas may not have a whole lot in common with someone living in northern Canada. But then as you get more specific, we get down to the level where we're talking about streets and houses. People living in the same house or living on the same street have a lot more in common with each other than somebody living in Texas and somebody living in northern Canada. The classification system. The way life is classified is similar to the way people are classified by where they live. So for example, the continent is the broadest category. Likewise, the domain is the broadest category of life. Humans and fungus are in the same domain of life, domain Eukaryota, but yet there's not a lot in common between people and mushrooms. However, if we consider gorillas, people and gorillas are in the same family, family Hominidae. We have a lot more in common. People and gorillas have a lot more in common than people and mushrooms. Species to domain. In other words, organisms of the same species have more in common than organisms of the same genus. Organisms of the same genus have more in common than organisms of the same family. Organisms of the same family have more in common than organisms of the same order. Organisms of the same order have more in common than organisms of the same class. Organisms of the same class have more in common than organisms of the same phylum. Organisms of the same phylum have more in common than organisms of the same kingdom, and organisms of the same kingdom have more in common than organisms of the same domain. We are Homo sapiens. Why are we given this special name? Binomial nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature is the formal system of naming a species. Each species name includes the organism's genus and a species epithet by name or descriptive name to identify it. So for example, dog and wolf are both common names, but they both have the same genus name. They're both a canis. Their species epithet, however, is different. For the domesticated dog, it's familiaris. For the wolf, it is lupus. But then if we look at the sugar maple tree, its genus name is different than the dogs and the wolves because the sugar maple tree is not in the same genus. It is not as closely related as the dogs and wolves are to each other. Rules for naming. Homo sapiens. The first letter of the genus is always capitalized, so the H is capitalized. The first letter of the species epithet is never capitalized. As we can see, it's a lowercase s. The whole name is italicized. so it's a little harder to write it out by hand. And then both the genus and the species epithet together are referred to as the name of the species. We are never just called sapiens.